There is a door in your head that no one told you about. It is the door through which we enter into life and pass out of life again. It is the door which separates ordinary consciousness from genius. It is the door that separates time-bound mind from timeless mind. The door that leads from personal consciousness to cosmic consciousness. The mysterious cultures that existed at the very beginning of recorded history, whose cultural and technical accomplishments demonstrate an almost unfathomable genius, took special care to immortalize the instructions that enable each individual to access their own hidden door.
Chris, for being with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share this amazing information with people. I want to say that your book has been one of the most revelatory that I've read ever, and the information contained within it. Sorry, Dylan?
I'm touched.
I'm touched, honestly. I mean, I think it is so interesting and also so helpful to us at this particular time. There's so much in there that will help us guide our way into the future. So I really appreciate that. The book is a very interesting read in that it is filled with a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and ecstasies beyond ecstasies. Mm-hmm. And what I would like to do today, because there are, for other people's edification, several interviews with you out there where you go into the protocols and the process. So if people are interested in understanding exactly how you obtain this information, they can buy this amazing book and also view those other interviews. So today what I'd like to do is focus on the content of the journeys and the teachings that you came to.
That sounds great.
Came to you. Now, I think we'll start with the worst of it, which you have called the ocean of suffering. And you have sessions let's step back for a second. You undertook 73 LSD sessions to obtain this information. And the book goes...
Between 1979 and 1999, over a 20-year period, I did 73 high-dose sessions. Actually, it was 3 medium-dose sessions and 70 high-dose, but for convenience, 73 high-dose sessions.
That is quite an undertaking.
Following the protocols established by Stan Grof. So these were completely internalized sessions, so on and so forth, eye shades, headphones, sitter, the whole 9 yards.
Would you consider that a clinical setting, per se, or a shamanistic setting, or just following the protocols that Grof actually developed?
Well, they emerged in a clinical setting, but whether you call it clinical or shamanistic sort of depends partly on your cultural perspective, on your cultural context. They were clinical in the sense of they originated in that therapeutic context, but they went far beyond therapeutic applications or therapeutic impact. And in that sense, it's not clinical per se.
Absolutely. That makes sense. All right. Ocean of Suffering. Sessions 11 through 17.
Yeah. Well, what had happened was in the first 2.5 years, I went through kind of classic perinatal symptomology, perinatal that Stan Grof describes in many of his books. And I went through at the end of the kind of a shattering ego death experience. It just kind of blew me apart, turned me inside out. And then after that, a whole new cycle began, a cycle that lasted 2 years of 14 sessions, where in the purifying phase of the session, which usually for me means the first half of the session, during the purifying phase of the session, I went into vast landscapes, panoramas of human suffering that went progressively deeper and deeper, session by session. And at first I thought this was a deepening of ego death. But over time, I became convinced that this was more than that. It had to be more than that because it involved subjectively so many thousands of people and so many thousands of years. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that something had shifted inside my sessions, and the consciousness that was directing my sessions was using my sessions to heal not my personal psyche, but some aspect of the collective unconscious of humanity. And so what happened was I did this work for a year. I stopped my work for 6 years. And then I began it again after 6 years for another year. The ocean of suffering, when I resumed after 6 years, began exactly where I had stopped. I think is an indication of the extraordinary intelligence and the precision of that intelligence that's directing these in our session work.
Well, that brings up a point that I do want to address with you, and that is the fact that these sessions seem very well planned, very well thought out. They're not haphazard trips, as people can experience when doing hallucinogens. And so tell me a little bit about who was doing the planning and who was doing the organizing of these 73 sessions that took you on this extraordinary journey.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't me. I was never in control of what happened in my sessions. You can set, when you're working, I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms per session, so very high doses of LSD. I don't recommend this protocol. I honestly don't, knowing what I know now. But when you do this work, you can set all the intentions you want. You can't direct what's happening in your sessions. So I think of it as a collaboration, a cooperation. My responsibility was to create as clean a field as possible to allow clear contact. So totally isolated from the world, totally internally focused. And at the end of every session, writing a detailed transcript of what happened during the sessions. I think that's important because it really helps us learn and hold on to what happened. And then it provides a clearer foundation when we return to the psychedelic state in the next session. So after I'd done that, after I cleared the set, I focused myself, did everything I could to establish a clean contact. After that, what happened in the sessions is entirely a matter of a larger consciousness that was directing my experiences or organizing my experiences. And I think this went far beyond anything in my personal unconscious because the scale of the sessions were just far vaster than anything I could dream up or imagine on my own. So I have to place the organization that's in the hands of the universe.
Absolutely. It's just for somebody that hasn't been on this journey, an inconceivable idea. And we'll get a little bit further on to some of the communications that you actually had, the interactivity and almost the discussions or the dialogues that you had with this consciousness, which fascinated me. But for a moment, I'm going to go back to the ocean of suffering just because some of the words you used to describe that period. So session 11, trapped in a chamber of horrors. Session 12, I was killed, mauled, maimed. Session 13, reminded of Dante's Inferno. Session 14, crescendo of torture, and session 15, excruciating pain and unspeakable horror. So the first thing is, why did you continue?
I know. Well, it's because of what happened in the second half of the sessions. First half of the sessions, I was taken into this terrible pain and suffering. But when I would go through that, and one of the most profound lessons I learned from Stan Grof is to completely trust the process. So if you don't fight what's happening, if you give yourself over to it completely, it will build and build. You'll hit a crescendo, And if you navigate this crescendo well, you will be spun into positive transpersonal spaces for the remainder of the session. So these sessions were not just ocean of suffering, but they were the ocean of suffering in the first hour or two. And then I would be spun into this extraordinary series of experiences that I describe in Deep Time in the Soul and the initiation into the universe, so that at the end of the session, what I would internalize was a phase of intense suffering and then hours of ecstatic participation in some aspect of the universe itself. So I would go back to it because I wanted that initiation into the universe.
Absolutely. It just sounds like such a space of torment. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the suffering. And when I first started reading the book, you explain, in session 24, actually, you get a little bit more deep into the cause or the purpose of the suffering. And you speak about this consciousness being a consciousness of incredible love overall.
Yeah.
And you say the pain had begun in love. And I was shown that the pain, did not represent a rupturing of love, but itself was an expression of this love. Being born into space-time, even the very birth of space-time itself, was an expression of unshakable love. And so what I'd like to do is just understand that a little bit more. How does all this torrential pain come from love?
Well, because creation comes from love. And I think the pain that I was encountering here was the pain that is somehow lodged in the collective psyche, the pain of human suffering over thousands and thousands of years, all the wars, all the terrible things we've done to each other, all the rapes, all the brutality, all this terrible suffering. And if this suffering is not cleared at the end of an individual life, it's not only the individual who has to bear the consequences of that undigested pain, but the species itself, the species mind, the collective unconscious of our species must also bear the burden of somehow reconciling itself with this terrible pain, which it does in different ways. But one of the ways that seems to have happened is I was able to go dissolve into the collective unconscious. And when the healing process deepened, it represented some type of lifting out of the collective psyche, this magnitude of suffering. And so when I say the suffering began in pain, what I mean is that all existence begins in divine love. And that one of the things I was shown in this process was we are actually co-creators in this process. We're not victims. This isn't being done to us. Existence is not being inflicted on us. And it's not a veil of tears. We're not being punished for anything. But creation is a long process, very long and drawn out, with many, many stages of incompleteness before we get to the greater places where we are still going. And so that we knew we were getting into this when we chose to participate in creation. We knew we were going to be dealing with a very unfinished and as yet imperfect system. And we volunteered for this process because of the grandeur of what is taking place, the grandeur of creation itself, moving from very simple organisms to very complicated organisms, from unconscious organisms to self-conscious and deepening self-conscious organisms. That's the love out of which the pain emerged. And the pain is simply the struggles, the inherent struggles of existing on this planet.
Do you think that the struggles rise out of a disconnection from this source? Or do you feel that it's more of the model that Stanislav Grof talks about, is that it's a birthing process, that it's actually, there's a period where we're birthing into this new human, if you will, and that associated journey down the birth canal is full of fear and torment and before we're actually born?
Yeah, well, I think in the early stages, there is an aspect of reliving our birth and experiencing the birth canal, because, the womb is how we get into time and space, and the grave is how we get out of time and space. So when our consciousness is expanding beyond our physical time-space consciousness, there is this kind of, we get into the revolving door of death and rebirth. So we often relive our birth in the process of being birthed back into spiritual reality. But I think that applies, that kind of language applies particularly in these early stages. It applies in the later stages, but not so literally in the same way. I mean, I have a chapter in the book, which I think is maybe the most important chapter, of the birth of the future human.
Yes.
So I'm looking at this historical crisis that we're entering, this global systems crisis driven by a global ecological crisis, as the context which is giving birth to a fundamentally changed human being, creating a shift in the collective psyche that we'll get to. And so I speak of that as a birth, and it is a birth, but it's not a birth in the sense of being trapped in a birth canal or something like this. It's the larger dynamic of a species which is in the process of self-transforming, self-emerging into a higher order of itself.
That's so interesting indeed. And we will get to that, because I do agree with you that that is a very important message for humanity and something that we all need to understand. And it kind of makes things a lot more hopeful.
It does. It really does.
We'll
Once we understand what's really happening underneath historical events.
One thing I just want to touch upon is that there is the theme that this process is not an individual initiation as it is, or an initial liberation or enlightening, that what is necessary here is this process is taken by humanity as its own individual organism, if you will.
Yeah. One of the things that happened repeatedly over the years is I dissolved into the species mind so deeply, and then into the context of the species mind and the evolutionary order of things, is that it became very, very clear to me that the creative intelligence that's behind the evolution, that's behind our universe, is not interested only in individuals, but it's interested in entire species. It's trying to awaken not just individuals, but it's trying to awaken the entire human species, the human family as one. So all of our individual efforts are fractal embodiments of a larger collective effort. So the collective informs the individual, and the individual influences the collective.
That makes a lot of sense. And also, it encourages me to be sympathetic and nice to other individuals, which I think is a very important message, because we also are one, you know, that idea of we are one. There is another saying that people use in literature that talks about awakening, and it's remember who you are, remember who you are. And that's something that has always baffled me a little bit. But in session 18, I believe, remember who you are, you and I creating. That was one of my favorite parts of the book, even though it was the worst pain ever for you in the beginning, cleansing aspect of that. But I love the story where it talks about underneath the horrors and the pain and the drama, there were these little dominoes of sweetness that would flip over. Yeah. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that story for our audience?
Well, it would probably take us too long to go through the entire session. The important part of this session, after going through this kind of Venetian blind, flipping back and forth between the terrible pain of the suffering of existence, flipping into the great sweetness, some extraordinary sweetness, going back and forth until eventually the process took me into this beautiful moment of clarity, and it showed me that the sweetness that I was experiencing was not the origin of pleasure, but the origin of existence itself. And with that, a bubble broke, and I came to a remembering of who I was in a deeper level, that I was consciousness. I was part of the consciousness that was the creative impulse of our universe, and that we are all sourced in this creative intelligence, this creative consciousness, which is driving our universe forward. it became really, this session was all about remember who you are, remember what you are. It really gets down to a very basic point. Our memories define the limits of our being. We are what we remember being. Most of us don't have memories beyond early childhood. But when you work with psychedelics and enter non-ordinary states of consciousness, or through meditation or near-death experiences or any number of different contexts, we can remember, our memories can be extended, our remembering can be extended beyond our childhood, beyond even birth, beyond even former lives. When we remember very, very deeply, our memories take us back to the creative impulse of existence itself, the very impulse that brought time and space into being. To remember that deeply, to have this as a memory, suddenly changes your self-definition, your sense of who and what you are. You understand that you are part of the creative universe. You're part of the energy that's creating the universe. And with that, there's just a tremendous reframing of your understanding of what your life is about and your understanding of what life itself is about.
I love in that session that your face was taken into the hands and you were looked in the eyes, and it was said to you, "It is you and I creating, my love. All suffering and ignorance is simply what has happened since we separated." So one of the things is in this book, you have actually met a cast of characters, if you want to call them that, but entities, consciousnesses. And that was just a beautiful experience, I can imagine.
It was a very meaningful experience. It's interesting, in DMT sessions, people have many experiences where they meet specific entities. And what's kind of curious about my LSD journey is that I had relatively few experiences meeting discrete individual entities. Basically, I kept being dissolved into layers and layers of being rather than into a state where I met individual beings. So this being, something took my face in its hands, looked into my eyes and said this, "You and I creating, my love." And so I've had many experiences of communion, contact, even conversation, dialogue with an intelligence. But this intelligence never took physical form, never took any kind of cultural specific form, never took a deity form, never took any form of archetypes. It was always a clear presence that I felt, but it was not a presence that was visible to me.
That's so interesting. So when they took you, you felt it. It was more of an experience and actually seeing this individual do it for you.
Yeah, but the words were very clear. The intention was very clear. Yeah.
Speaking of the dialogue, I love the Circle of Learning in session 19, the Cosmic Tour. In that session, you really seem to really begin this intense dialogue with this consciousness.
Yeah.
So go ahead. It wasn't so much of a dialogue per se as an experiential.
Yeah, basically when I came through the ocean of suffering in that session, I basically there were several preliminary experiences, but eventually I came into an arena where I was in dialogue with this consciousness, and I could know anything that I wanted to know if I could endure it. So in this arena, I would ask questions, and it would respond to me by orchestrating my experience in order to show me what it was that I wanted to understand. And then eventually it took me on what I call the cosmic tour. It seemed to be the creative intelligence of the universe, and it seemed to be delighted to be able to finally be showing human beings, and me only as representative of my species, coming back to the creative intelligence, and it wanted to show us what it had accomplished during all these 13.7 billions of years. And it would take me somewhere and show me something, and I would understand. And sometimes what I saw was so mesmerizing, I would sort of stop and be just dumbfounded by the beauty of it. And it would come back from me, and it would say, hurry up, got more to show you.
I know, it's keep up. Come on.
keep up. It's just astounding, the magnitude of the intelligence that's embedded in our universe, that manifests our universe, and the magnitude of the love that lies at the very font of creation. This was a staggering revelation for me. And when I began this work, even though I have a background in, religious studies, I began this work as an atheist. I began this work as an agnostic, an atheistically inclined agnostic. I really was very skeptical about the reality of a transcendent dimension or the knowability of a transcendent dimension. So this was a major kind of shift in my worldview to even envision the possibility that we could enter into states which were so cognitively rich as these states were.
Can you share with us one part of the tour that you have digested and explained to us that was beautiful?
Well, the challenging part is that I simply don't have enough PhDs to hold in my conscious awareness many of the things that I was shown. If I had PhDs in physics, in astrophysics, and cosmology, I would have a better chance of being able to have retained cognitively specific information that I was shown in those circumstances. In other sessions, I had very powerful experiences, and I was able to bring them back because they were somewhat related to things that I was educated in. I was shown many things about reincarnation. I was shown many things about how reincarnation works that led me to have an understanding of reincarnation. It's very different than the way it's presented in Eastern cultures.
And you have a book about that as well.
Yeah, my first book is a book on reincarnation called Life Cycles, because it just, to me, reincarnation is a fact of life. There's overwhelming empirical evidence that this is the case. We didn't have this evidence 50 years ago. We do today. But kind of psychologically, what motivated, what was behind my writing that book, though I don't discuss it in the book, was in the sessions, my own experience of the karmic intentionality of my life and some of my former lives that surfaced in the sessions themselves. I don't talk about it in Life Cycles. I really try to stay in the basis of publicly available research. But that was the background to the book.
You also talk about that it's an evolutionary impulse.
Yeah.
Reincarnation. So again, not just for the individual, but for humanity as well.
Yes, I see reincarnation as part of evolution. It's the higher octave of evolution. So evolution evolves whole groups. It folds collective learning forward in time. Somehow nature has found a way, or the intelligence of nature has found a way to evolve individuals within certain species and to fold individual learning forward in time. So it's not just individual human beings who are reincarnating. All of humanity is reincarnating, and that means we're all growing together, and all of us growing together is part of our species evolving and growing and developing new capacities over long periods of time. So it's very much of an evolutionary dynamic.
And while we're here, I may as well touch upon a question I had for a little bit further on. When you're saying that evolution evolves an individual and that individual puts that information back into the pot, if you will, for the rest of the collective, there is a huge theme in your book in the respect that you, by going through all of this pain, in a way, you were digesting and healing this collective consciousness. Now, I know for myself on the work that I have done personally, that I need to go back into the pain and release it or work with it or acknowledge it and thank it and send it goodbye. So in a sense, you have done some of this work on a larger scale.
I did. And I want to really emphasize, even though I went through many layers of suffering in this process, I don't carry any trauma from this work. I mean, there's nothing undigested that bothers me I went into what the Buddhism calls the hell realms. People go into the hell realms in different circumstances, but it didn't stick in my system as trauma because I saw it through to its conclusion. I took it all the way down to the base. Whatever was given to me, I took it down to the base and was much more than amply rewarded in the ecstatic experiences that followed. So the whole cycle of going into pain, breaking through the pain, going into the reward phase of a session, that's what I internalize as. So now, having done this work, some of the blessings that I received in later sessions were the direct correlation or the consequence of having done the collective cleansing. So the principle of karma is whatever we do for others comes back to us in one form or another. So I had been given an opportunity and an invitation to help in this collective transformation. And I think this is nothing terribly heroic. This is what any mother would do for her children. Any father would do for his children. If you saw someone suffering and you had an opportunity to help them and not make them not suffer, any human being worth their salt would do that. Same thing happened here. This opened in the sessions. I had an opportunity. I took the opportunity. Then later in the sessions, when this light began to fill me and when I began to enter into orders of ecstasy and beatific visions, that really was a crescendo in many years of work. That was the natural, organic manifesting within my individual awareness of the historic process that humanity is going through as a collective. We are going through a purification process. We're going through a detoxification process. We're going through a collective death and rebirth process, and that will be very, very clear in the decades ahead. We're going through a death rebirth process, but death is followed by rebirth. Purification is followed by ecstatic joy.
So, sweetie, what is it? Is it the seeing it? Is it the holding it? Is it the experiencing of it? What is the mechanism that clears this pain away? In the respect that on a very, very grand scale, you've done very, very grand work, but possibly if we can understand the process, we can undertake some of it ourselves. So what is the trigger? What do we need to get to actually work on this to help clear some of this away?
I think that what we do in a session is simply what is happening in life always, all the time, except it gets very concentrated and amplified in a session. But the dynamics are fundamentally similar. Remember that LSD, or psychedelics in general, they don't predicate a particular experience. They don't give us a specific experience. They are simply amplifiers of consciousness. So what happens in a session is simply what is happening in life, but larger, faster, deeper. And I think the key to engaging suffering in a way that lifts suffering out of the system is the same way that is true for therapy or engaging life in general. We have to sit with what it is that's bothering us. We have to enter into a conscious rapport with the suffering and let it come into us, let our awareness take it in. The only difference here was the scale of the suffering involved, the scale of the memories that were being activated. But the basic process to let those memories come into my awareness without understanding where they were coming from at the time or what it was serving, letting them come into my awareness. And my experience is that they come into my awareness and they flow through me, that there's a sense of flowing. It flows through me. And I think it flows into the light. It flows and it allows some type of deep reconciliation to take place.
I think conscious rapport is perfect. I in my own limited experience, that's what it feels like to me, that there is a conscious interaction, a rapport with it, and that really does help to know that it works on larger scales.
Yeah, it does. And I think it works in a reincarnational context. I think, for example, that there are many more bodhisattvas in the world than we think, perhaps, that there are many people who are suffering, so to speak, in their physical lives, in their ordinary day-to-day lives. They are suffering more pain than, so to speak, is their just due, more pain than is their explainable in terms of personal karma. I think there are many people who are also trying to lift the collective psyche, and they are willing to open their lives to dimensions of suffering that come at them in very tangible, concrete ways. It's nothing, they come very tangible, and they take it on and they try to change. They try to change it. They're trying to change people's lives. They go into places in the world where there is suffering. They don't need to go into those places, but they go into those places to take on that pain in some way and make a difference with respect to that pain. Same principle as happens in a psychedelic session.
Indeed. Council of Elders, again, this was another area of interactive dialogue. And I found it very interesting, the idea that to actually receive this knowledge, you had to prepare for it. You needed explicit training. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. Well, when you start to go into dialogue with this infinite consciousness that can show you so many things at so many levels, you truly have to train yourself to stay cognitively coherent when you're working at so many deep levels of consciousness. And it happens kind of spontaneously in your work, but in this particular session, it seemed that I needed kind of training to help make this better. And so I was in this council of elders. I was in this surrounded by beings, again, that I didn't see, but I felt. And I could know anything I wanted if I could endure the consequences of knowing it. So I would put forward a question, and the elders would take it, and then they would start to gather, they would start to chant. The music was the Tibetan chanting, the very deep guttural chanting of the Gyuto monks in Tibet. They would chant and chant, and then they would release this knowing at me. And if I was centered when this knowing hit me, it would send me into an orgy of cognitive ecstasy, showing me things, just showing me things. But if I wasn't centered, if I had allowed myself to get distracted and I wasn't centered when this knowing hit me, it would just shatter me. It would just shatter my mind, and I could not stay cognitively coherent. So in this particular session, many, many times I was shattered. Many times I was sent into cognitive ecstasy. But the point was to train. You literally have to train yourself first to reach this level of consciousness, and then you have to train yourself to learn how to receive information that's coming from different dimensions of consciousness. You have to learn how to stay awake and how to stay coherent in levels of consciousness which are beyond any levels that you've ever experienced before. And it can be done. I mean, the shamanic cultures are masters of learning how to enter these states of consciousness. Meditation masters are masters at learning how to enter these deep states of consciousness. It's just the same dynamic, just within a psychedelic context.
Has this training stayed with you, and is there any application for it in normal consciousness?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so.
Well, I don't know who's going to be releasing such ecstatic knowledge at you in normal consciousness, but I mean, are there any, has it stayed with you? Are you in a place where you can activate your mind, your consciousness in that way in normal consciousness?
It is the question of the relationship between the experiences one has in deep psychedelic states and then your ordinary resting consciousness when your session is over. That's a complicated question. It's clearly we cannot take our experiences back and stabilize our present earth consciousness in those states. It would be wonderful if we could. I wish we could, wish I could. but it's a more subtle process. I think these experiences, if we handle them well, if we record them and learn from them, they give us practices. They literally give me practices that I'm supposed to do every day after the sessions, in between the sessions. If we use them well, and particularly if we stay grounded, because it's the greatest danger of working in psychedelic states is psychic inflation. Because we have had an extraordinary experience, we think we must be an extraordinary person. That's just not true. We have to stay grounded. But if we stay grounded, the experiences that we're given, I think, act as strange attractors and accelerate our evolutionary development in a certain direction. So I hope that some of the experiences I've had, some of the learnings that I've been given, some of the training in terms of focusing my consciousness I trust that it is affecting me and it is benefiting me outside of the sessions, both directly and indirectly. But actually, I think the proof is in the pudding when I die. In Buddhism, all spiritual practice is training you for what will happen when you die.
Absolutely.
So I think the same thing is true in psychedelic sessions. If you engage them conscientiously, they are training you and preparing for you to enter into states of consciousness that are waiting for you when you die. And so I think there's a strong correlation there.
Do you have an idea of what level we go to when we die? Since you have visited so many different levels of creation, of before creation, did you get a sense of what level we naturally end up at?
Well, I've had many experiences that basically make sense. I understand them in terms of the Eastern concept of the bardo, or the multiple levels of reality one enters when you die. The basic idea is that you don't go to a place, but you go to a complex domain which has many, many layers, and the level that you go to reflects the level of your present spiritual development, your ability to stay conscious. So all of these levels are part of the bardo. They're part of samsara. They're part of the evolving cyclic nature of nature, the cyclic patterns of nature. It's also possible to penetrate all the way through the bardo and enter extra samsaric reality, what is sometimes called extra samsaric, or beyond the domain of samsara. I would place the diamond luminosity experiences at extra samsaric reality, outside that reality. So where one goes when one dies really depends upon how much homework one has done while one is here.
Absolutely, my love. And speaking of dying, you died a lot.
I'm afraid so. Guilty.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you died over and over and over and over again, and so it has changed your perspective on death. Absolutely, having died.
Well, yeah. One of the things is you learn that being afraid of death is just such a sadness. I mean, I'm not only am I not afraid of dying, but I'm looking forward to being dead. I mean, I'm not looking forward to the act of dying, but there's absolutely no fear for me in what will happen to me when I die, and I'm looking forward to it because I've crossed that line multiple times over the course of all these years of work. And so I feel comfortable where I'm going. I'm filled with ecstatic joy of where I'm going. And I think it's not just me, but I think we should all be filled with ecstatic expectations, ecstatic joy at the prospect of where we go. If we are afraid of death, then we've got our entire world upside down. The hard work is done inside time and space. This is the hard place. Where we go when we die is not the hard place. All this Hollywood malarkey about the shadows and darkness and da-da-da-da and demonic and da-da-da-da. No, it's much more benign than that. It's much more intelligent than that. It's much more compassionate than that. Yeah, so to me, death is something I'm looking forward to.
The first time you died, there was fear associated with it. Was the second time a little bit easier? Or was this, I mean, like, did you get to the point, oh, here it comes again? Or was there always just a little bit of, oh, here we go again?
Well, the essence of dying, of course, is losing complete control. You lose complete control of your identity. You lose complete control of your knowledge. You lose complete control of anything to do with what you are and who you are. And that always has a frightening quality. But if you go through this multiple times, several things happen. One of them is you learn to trust the process, and you learn that you can die and the very structure of your life can be completely dissolved, but you will reawaken some essence of you, some better version of you will wake up in a different reality of total unexpected joy. You learn that there really is no such thing truly as death. The form of your life can be destroyed, but the essence of your life is indestructible, and therefore you cannot die. Now, that doesn't mean that in some way it gets easier, but when you're going through the middle of an advanced death and rebirth process, it's still terrifying and it's still frightening just because it is a deep, deep unraveling of anything you've ever known. So that the unraveling in the beginning is the unraveling of your time-space identity, your body, mind, ego. But the
and that
unraveling
is terrifying. I've had that experience because I've once done an LSD trip when I was in Amsterdam, and I remember trying to hold on to the me, the egoic me, with all my strength, and it was terrifying to think of that being dissipated, and I hadn't read the books, and I didn't know what would happen if I let go. So it was just holding on to me. So it is a terrifying experience.
It is, but as you do it, as you repeat it, you get a little more used to it. So that aspect of the total fear that grips you in the beginning, that ceases. It's a different quality of fear. It's a more informed quality of fear, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
In the end, of course, what happens is that death becomes your best friend. Because what I learned, I know, it's a strange thing.
I'm a Scorpio, and that's even hard for me.
I learned late in the last 5 years of work that there are many degrees of dying, and the deepest ecstatic experiences, the deepest visionary experiences follow the deepest death experiences. Once you understand that there are levels and levels of dying, followed by levels and levels of ecstatic revelation, then death becomes your friend. You not only don't want to avoid it, you seek it out. You create conditions in your sessions where you want the turbulence and the destructuring that is associated with death. And you choose it because you know what's waiting for you on the other side of this radical destructuring. So death becomes your best friend. Death becomes your mistress.
Sure.
I mean, it sounds strange to put it that way, but death is your gateway into transcendence.
Speaking of which, on the other side of death, in session 22 and 23, you were shown the master plan for humanity.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to go through death. Let's speak a little bit about that.
Well, this was actually one of the real surprises for me in this work, because this all took place between when I was 30 and 50 years old. And this started in 79 to 99. And when I started this work, I wasn't concerned about the fate of humanity. I really was completely tuned out to global ecological crisis. This was just before that time for me. But what happened was, starting in the 22nd, 23rd session, the theme of human evolution, the theme of the master plan, and I apologize for the patriarchal quality maybe of that term. I don't mean it that way. The master plan of humanity. And it kept coming back again and again. And it actually continued all the way to the 70th session. So in the 70th session, I was given one deep, deep final vision, which was once again the capstone of this story. And it was always a consistent story. So the story basically, for about 3.5 years, the story had different components, but the story always had the same fundamental structure. Humanity was coming to a turning point. Humanity was coming to a major breakthrough. This was a breakthrough in history that would divide between the before and after. Just an enormous spiritual breakthrough. And it was a breakthrough not of individuals, but it was the entire species. And it was coming up inside it. It was coming up from within the collective consciousness. And it was catapulting us into an accelerated development beyond anything that we had known previously. But in all of these years of visions, which I present in the book and in this chapter, The Birth of the Future Human, I was never shown how nature was going to accomplish this. I did not understand how it was going to accomplish this. And along the way, I began to do my ecological homework. I began to read the books, really helping me become better educated about what's happening. And then in 1995, in the 55th session, it took me into deep time, it took me into the future. And it gave me an experience of the death and rebirth of our species. It took me into the critical turning point that these visions had been talking about. And I experienced this not as an individual. It wasn't Chris Bache who had this experience. But at that point, I was completely dissolved into the species mind, into the collective unconscious. And I experienced the death and rebirth of our species as the species. And it was a period, again, and it didn't give me the details, it didn't give me any specifics about when, where, and how, but it was a global systems crisis triggered by a global ecological crisis, and it continued for decades. It basically triggered a profound suffering as we lost control of the conditions of our life. Life as we knew it was shattered at the core. And it looked for a time that we would all be killed, that this was an extinction process. But just when it was at its worst, eventually the crisis passed and things began to get better. And the survivors began to pick themselves up and began to put things back together. And when they began to re-engage each other and engage life, they found that they were working in a completely different internal reality, that values which had been activated in the depth of this crisis, ways of knowing, ways of being in the world, had been activated, and a shift had taken place, we would say, in the collective unconscious, a shift at the foundation of our being, the collective psyche. So the entire post-crisis world was saturated with new values, new perspectives, new social units, new ways of understanding. There was a tremendous opening of the human heart into compassion for other beings, not only human beings, but for other beings, other species. There was a tremendous opening of the human mind to be open and transparent to the intelligence of the universe that could now infuse itself more cleanly and clearly into our human consciousness. So, I mean, really, honestly, it's a cliche, I know, but we became a species of Buddhas. Humanity became a collective Buddhas and a species of Christs and prophets. I mean, we basically made this deep turning point. And then in the 70th session, several years later, it gave me one final capstone retrospective in which it showed me everything that it had showed me before and gave me a couple of last pieces of instruction concerning this transformational process. The reason I think this is the most important part of the book is naturally because my personal transformation, who cares, one person, but this is all of our children, all of our grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. This is what this is our work. This is our collective work. This is what I'm here for, what you're here for, what we are all here for, is to participate and to support this collective transformational process. And I think it's been building through the 20th century. It's going to continue to build through the 21st century. I'm expecting a series of punctuated crises that's just going to be showing us we're going to be inheriting the limitations of our previous worldview, of our less than conscious participation on this earth.
Well, if you think about it, when you are doing right now, basically you cannot turn on the TV, the radio, or a newspaper without hearing about our climate disaster and our ecological damage. But when you were doing this work, it wasn't very top of mind. It wasn't something. So even having that disclosure in these sessions was really very much predicting the future, if you will, or predicting the now back in those times. And so, right now it of course it would be an ecological disaster, but back then when you were doing it, that itself must have been quite revelatory, because possibly we were thinking more of war or annihilation, nuclear annihilation, of those kinds of things, if we had to put a finger on what would end us. And also it sounds, go ahead, sweetie.
And this awareness rises not only in psychedelic states, and it is, I don't use the word prophetic, but it is visionary. And when you go into deep visionary states, you breach the laws of time. You open yourself up into future time. But it's not just in psychedelic states, but deep contemplatives have these experiences. Indigenous people have been having these visions of the future of humanity, and the indigenous brothers and sisters have been warning the civilized members of the human family about what we're doing to the planet. And I have a passage from Bede's Griffiths in that chapter, The Birth of the Future Human, who is a Christian Hindu saint, a contemplative, and he had these kind of visions about where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The process,
it caught me completely by surprise back then.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. We have to think that this was a while back, that it's not, it wasn't what all the awareness that there is now. The process sounds very much like an individual death process. However, in the respect that in the book you talk about how everything that we rely on today goes away. Everything that we take for granted. And so that there's this incredible chaos, and it's that for the survivors, that the ability, the necessity to kind of come up with a new way of doing things that we had done poorly before. And that is almost part of the process of the initiation into the new human.
Yeah. I think that people individually who are making the transition in advance of the collective, who see what's happening, and they're making the changes in their own life. They've made decisive steps to take down the barriers between race, between religion, between cultures. They've eliminated those barriers in their own heart. They're basically working to live a different relationship with the earth, to preserve the life systems of the planet, to reduce their footprint, to move into voluntary simplicity. The beings who have made the steps in their personal life, those beings, I think, become seed catalysts in our future transformation. My sense is that when we go into this crisis of the future, it's going to last so long, and it's going to affect so many people, and it's going to be so disruptive and so hard on us that it's going to stimulate not only our individual psyches, but so many people will be having these disruptive experiences that it's going to hyperstimulate the collective unconscious. It'll drive the collective unconscious into what we call nonlinear systems in a nonlinear range. And we know something about physical systems when they are driven into nonlinear conditions or far from equilibrium states. I think that something that happens to physical systems, there is an analogy to what will happen in psychological systems in the psychic field of the human species. And when this field is pressurized, small perturbations, the chaos theoreticians like to say, small changes can produce disproportionate outcomes. The species will be able to mobilize unexpected insights, unexpected forms of knowledge, unexpected understandings will emerge, so to speak, almost out of nowhere, but it's actually emerging out of our own innate potential, out of our own being. So faster than we could imagine, the changes will take place faster than we could conceive of if we were looking at the history of the past, because the history of the past is somewhat non-linear. But when we go into such a profound crisis, we move into, the past is linear. But when we go into this profound crisis, we go into non-linear conditions and non-linear dynamics.
It sounds very scary, but very exciting. For those of us who haven't died 30 times, you know, but I mean, it's like having a baby. That's very scary too, you know, but at the end of
absolutely
the reward of this.
Yeah, having a baby is an excellent analogy, because when you have a baby, gestation lasts 9 months. It's a very, very long process, but labor is very, very intense, but relatively short. And I think that's also true for our species going into this crisis. We have been gestating the future human for hundreds of thousands of years. We've been doing it through reincarnation, learning, more reincarnation, more development. But the time of birth is a relatively short, intense period that makes enormous demands, just as labor does for a woman. That's what we're going through. We are going into a labor of history, the labor of the future human. Yeah. And it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be, I think, profoundly meaningful. And in the end, when we die, would you rather have a nice, happy life, pleasant, but basically kind of boring, not very significant? Or would you rather have a life where you knew you were invested in something that meant something, that was worth something, that was profound? And I think that's what we're going into.
I agree with you. I'm also a believer in reincarnation, and you know, you see the trends that are happening right now, and I often think about, if nothing changes, how much worse the next lives are going to be. So to get in there, to dig in, do the work that we can, be part of the process, and come out the other end, I think it's a wonderful option.
Yeah. And it's really important, I think, late in my sessions, I began to feel that it's important for us to understand the future human that we are becoming. Imagine if you went into labor and you didn't know you were pregnant, and you didn't understand what was happening to you. It'd be terrifying. It'd be terribly frightening. And when we go into this dark period of history, if we don't have an understanding of what's happening, that we are really giving birth, we could succumb to despair. We could, you know, we're already seeing all these trauma movies, you know, about apocalyptic this and apocalyptic that. We really have to keep our eye on the horizon. We have to understand what we're doing. This is a spiritual transformation. It's a psycho-spiritual transformation.
So let's end on the future human. Tell us what we're all going to be like.
I can't tell you what the world will be like, but I can describe my experience of touching the future human. And several times in the course of the sessions, I was taken into deep time and given an opportunity to try on for size, so to speak, the human psyche at the stage of the future human. And this happened very powerfully in the 70th session at the culmination of this long process. And such a magnificent being, just such an extraordinary being. It was so helpful, having experienced the death and rebirth of humanity, having experienced so many different layers, to experience this future human, magnificent being, a mind, truly enlightened mind, tuned to the deep structure of the universe, tuned to the intelligence of the universe, a heart that was deeply in touch with other human beings and sensitive to its history, its longer history with other human beings, a heart which can embrace the entire planet, a heart which has a deep appreciation for the damage that we've done to the living systems on this planet and to the species that are going extinct, and a commitment to reverse that, to bring forward safe habitat, to basically restore these systems. But an open heart, an open mind, a transformed human being. That's where we're going. And I think that one way of understanding the great religious saints and sages of history, to understand Christ, to understand the Buddha, is all of them basically are describing what I'm describing. They're describing a way of living, which is deeply different than if you develop your values basically only in terms of, space-time consciousness. This is the awakened heart, the awakened mind.
Look, there are people throughout history, people that have been burned at the stake, for example, because they had such faith that there was more than just this physical incarnation. But, there's been so few of them throughout history. And to have a whole planet full of people with this awareness, I think would be amazing.
I think we are basically cleaning our psychic basement. We are cleaning the collective unconscious. We're cleaning our individual unconscious. And in that process, we are learning how to create consciously. Right now, a lot of our creativity is unconscious creativity. We're being dragged around hither and thither through our own unconscious conditioning, our own unconscious history. But in the course of this transformative process, as we clear our unconscious conditioning, as we clear it collectively, we then begin to be able to manifest our intelligence in conscious acts of creativity. We will be able to do extraordinary things that we can only dream of doing now in future time. It's about becoming a more conscious creative being.
You make the comment that creation is a result of choices.
Yes.
And so it's the conscious choices, I guess, instead of the myriad of thousands of unconscious choices that we make every day, that one of the distinctions will be that we will be more conscious in the choices that we make, perhaps?
More conscious of the choices we make. I think part of how the word system works is we're in a living universe. We're in a dynamic universe. And we make a choice. And the universe responds to that choice by, triggering a series of events. I don't mean to be superficial in describing how this process works. There's layers and layers to it. But in the beginning, our understanding is incomplete, and there's a lot of ignorance in our choices. And we inherit the consequences of ignorant choices. And in this process, we learn. We think, for example, we can hurt somebody else without hurting ourselves. And we inherit the karma of that act in order to learn that we are all actually embedded in each other's lives. We are all leaves on the same tree, so that we make wiser choices, more conscious choices. And we begin to make choices that are not at the expense of other beings, but actually enhance the well-being of other beings. And that generates its own kind of feedback cycles in our life. It's not to oversimplify it, but the dynamics are basically there.
And it feels good. I know that when I make somebody else's life feel better, it feels good. And I'm surprised at how little that goes on. It's like, it's just amazing to me because it's good for me, it's good for them, it's good for everything. But anyway, we'll get there, it sounds like, Chris.
We will. I think we will. Kindness feels good. Courage feels good. Generosity feels good. Truth feels good. That's not to say, it's hard to make the right choices in challenging circumstances. It's hard when you're not getting what you think you should have, to basically give what you have away, to share what you have with someone in need. But it feels good, and it takes us in the right direction.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, my dear, for spending this time with me. I really have appreciated it. And as I said at the beginning, I really have a much more hopeful perspective now for the future. And I'm not so scared of death.
Good.
I have been.
Good.
Reading this, I'm like, if Chris can do it, I can do it.
Absolutely. There is nothing. I drop out a lot of the personal aspects of my journey in the book. I'm really only interested in the larger universal aspects and the collective aspects and the cosmological aspects. What's important is not that I had these experiences. What's important is that these experiences are available for all of us to have, and they give us some insight to the background textures of our lives. That's what's important. As a philosopher, I think that's the important thing. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Vanessa. I really thank you for the opportunity to have this time with you and for your viewers.
Thank you so much, my love. You have a wonderful day.